right, can you hear me there? Yep, got it. Okay, good to go. Thumbs up from the back row. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kane Thornton. I'm the head of the Clean Energy Council. Welcome to this side event, Financing the Clean Energy Transition. The buzz out there earlier on was that this was going to be the side event of the entire COP. No pressure on the keynote speaker and the panellists you're about to hear from, but welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to start by, recognising the increasing prominence of First Nations voices at COP. I think it's been observant over the years, increasingly present, which is absolutely appropriate given both the role and the implications of climate change for First Nations people. And it's great, I think, to be here in the Australia Pavilion and see a strong First Nations presence. So if I can recognise First Nations leaders, elders, past, present and future. So as we know, Australia has an enormous opportunity to become a global clean energy superpower, to fundamentally change our energy system, fundamentally change our economy to be driven by renewable energy. And over the past 12 months, I think it's fair to say the building blocks are being put in place to make that occur. Only a couple of weeks, we had the federal government restate their commitment to 82% renewable energy by 2030, make a commitment to an expanded policy mechanism to deliver it. We've seen extensive reform to how we're delivering transmission around the country, how we're engaging communities, developing our workforce, all of the crucial bits of the jigsaw puzzle and the foundation to deliver 82% renewables by 2030. What we know is that finance is absolutely crucial to that. We need to unlock enormous amounts of capital, debt and equity to support the delivery of that level of new renewable generation in the country over the next 5 years and indeed the decades beyond that. How to unlock that capital, the impact of the emerging policy environment both in Australia and globally, how we overcome some of the emerging challenges for the energy transition, what this means for business models and financing and deal structures in Australia and around the world are all going to be the hot topics of conversation over the course of the next 55 minutes. We've got a fantastic panel lineup that I will introduce to you shortly to share their both global and Australian perspectives on this critically important topic. But we're going to kick off with I was calling it a keynote speech. I heard someone call it a lightning speech, so I'm going to go with a lightning speech. No pressure, Kobad. But we're going to hear from someone who is very well known to, I think, the Australians in the audience, as a long-time friend of the Clean Energy Council and is really enormously respected, I think, both in Australia and around the world for his insights on the energy transition. Kobad is, of course, the Global Head of Strategy with Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He's also an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales, and he's here to share his insights and perspectives in a lightning format. Please welcome Kobad Bhavnagri. Kobad.
All right, and I'm done. Thank you. That would be lightning. It's wonderful to speak here in front of such a huge crowd, and Kane really knows how to build an audience. But this is actually pretty good for a COP crowd. So I'm going to give you a quick fire starter. Really, that's probably the more appropriate term, fire starter, on what we need to do to close the investment gap. Well, what the gap is actually. So firstly, Bloomberg NEF, we're a research firm that specialise in the energy transition and the ecological transition more broadly. And we cover all of the technologies and all of the markets that is going to hopefully deliver a clean economy and also a nature positive one. So one of the things we do as a company is we count dollars, we count transactions, assets, where the money flows and gets spent. And this chart really shows all the money that we've been counting since the firm started back in 2004. And you can see it's a very nice, impressive story of growth. And we hit an important milestone last year of $1 trillion of new money flowing into assets in clean energy and more broadly in the energy transition. So this includes things like CCS, electric vehicles, nuclear power, of course, renewables, etc. One of the key things that you'll notice really is the emergence of green, which is spend on electrified transport. So spending on renewable energy assets actually has, kind of softened. The growth rate, at least, has softened over the last decade, and it was the advent of electric vehicles which brought new money into the sector, and that's meant that we continue to get an upward trajectory. And so, we can only hope that there are new colours that will keep on opening up wedges here and drive money to the larger quantities that we need. That $1 trillion was also very notable because it was the first time in our numbers that spending on the energy transition drew level with spending on the fossil fuel supply chain, and all upstream, downstream, and midstream. And keep that ratio in your mind, because what that tells us is that for every $1 spent on the fossil fuel economy, $1 is being spent on the clean economy. And this ratio is important, as you'll come to see. Who is spending the money? Where is it coming from? No surprises, China is half of it. China has consistently outspent everybody, and often everybody else combined. Certainly much more than the US. I'm sure John will have some things to say about that. But the other sort of countries at the second half of this chart tend to bounce around depending on policy strength and progress. But it's a pretty consistent picture of China leading it. Now, how much do we need? That's what we're doing. How much do we need? So on our modelling of the global energy system, we think that on a business as usual basis, so no new policy, economics continuing to unfold, clean energy getting cheaper, EVs getting cheaper, hydrogen probably not getting much cheaper without policy intervention, we think we'd see about $120 trillion worth of spend on clean energy. So business as usual actually is going to do a lot. It's going to deliver a lot. But in order to deliver a net zero outcome by 2050, we of course need to spend more. And we'll need to spend up to about $195 trillion. And again, you can see this balance that about half of that goes to transportation and electric vehicles, and about half of that then goes on everything else, including the electricity grid. So quite a lot of money, but the difference between BAU and net zero is not that frightening, actually. It's only about 75 trillion. Sounds big when you say it in trillions, but in absolute terms, it's not radical. We don't need magnitudes more investment. The goal of tripling renewables that, fingers crossed, gets agreed in the final text over here, is consistent with bringing the world onto a net zero pathway by our numbers. So that's what we model in the net zero scenario. And what we actually forecast that is going to occur just based on looking at the project pipeline and our understanding of where money is flowing and what policies are likely to achieve, we think actually we're going to get close. So this, continues the time-honoured tradition of UN climate promises, which is you only promise what is already going to happen anyway. But nevertheless, it would be an important goal. But investment has to keep tripling, really, in order to be on track for net zero. And of course, we need to see lots and lots of continued growth. And, all the way up to nearly $8 trillion per annum being spent in the 2040s. Just leave enough time for everyone to take their photos. You can get me in it as well if you... Yeah. You could get one of me, Sally, so at least I can prove to my wife that I did something. So back to this ratio about spending. So remember, 1-to-1 is what we're currently spending. This is what we need to do. This is the capital allocation ratio that is necessary to get on track for net zero. And this is a really potent, powerful way to think about net zero and think about transition. Super relevant for a bank. We've done this analysis for GFANs, but also extremely relevant for a corporate. If you'll say, I've got a net zero target, how do I judge where I'm on track? It can often boil down to a simple thing. How much money are you spending on the fossil system? How much money are you spending on the clean system? And what part of your balance sheet, how much of it is going to what? And so we need to get to that a 4-to-1 ratio So part of that is, we're definitely tapering down spend on fossil, but we need to massively increase spending on clean. That needs to get to 6 to 1 by the 2030s to 40s, and then 10 to 1 by the 2040s to 50s. So that's really the best way to reduce this down, is thinking about how every dollar of clean needs to be 10 times more than what you spend on dirty. For Australia, the numbers, of course, are a little bit smaller. We think we'll spend about 1.2 trillion on a BAU type scenario, and would need to get up to about 1.9 trillion in a net zero scenario. In a hydrogen export scenario or renewable export scenario, would need a couple of trillion more. And we really need to get on with it straight away. We need an immediate lift in spending. We've got to be going up to billions and billions per year in order to hit these goals. So with that, please don't copy any of our stuff, so all those photos are null and void. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Flash. That was excellent and kept with time. Thanks very much, Cobat. I'm now going to welcome my panellists up onto stage. If each of you would like to come on up and take a seat. Do I need to hit a button here? I think I may. There we go. I'll just briefly introduce each of them. Let's see which order. Matt, do you want to actually jump on the other end for me? I might take that one. Not quite in order. Sorry, I squeezed it. Smooth as the energy transition, that one, wasn't it? Right. So, they like that one. Sally, let's start with you. Sally Torgerman is a partner at KPMG in the Commercial Advisory and Transactions team in New South Wales, specialising in National Infrastructure Assets and Places Division. Welcome to you, Sally. 18 years experience in the sector, and I didn't realise this, you have a dual qualified degrees, electrical engineer and lawyer. Look at that, a lawyer who knows what they're talking about in the energy sector. Welcome to you, Sally. That was a bit unfair, wasn't it? Oh, yeah, that's right. Monique, welcome to you, Chief. I'm insulting everyone today, aren't I? Monique Miller is the Chief Investment Officer at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Welcome to you, Monique. 20 years experience, significant experience in the CEFC and being part of its extraordinary contributions to financing and driving the transition in Australia. And prior to that, worked at both Macquarie and Baker McKenzie. So welcome to you, Monique. John, I don't know where to start with your CV. John is the chair of the Americas for Pollination, an organisation that will be familiar to many people in the audience and from Australia. I don't know where to start with the rest of your CV other than to say it's extensive. Having worked in the Biden administration, served as the US Treasury Department's climate counsellor, managing and coordinating a historically ambitious set of policies and priorities, the President's White House Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change prior to that, Chief of Staff and Chief Operating Officer at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, etc., etc. So welcome to you, John. Fantastic to have your global perspective. And Matt Rebeck, who is the CEO of RES Australia, one of the leading renewable developers in Australia. Matt's been in that role for quite some time, a decade or more, and RES has obviously been at the forefront of developing renewable projects across the country, and before that, and RES in fact has a long history in the UK and Europe. So welcome to you, Matt, and a former Director of the Clean Energy Council. Welcome, Matt. Great to have you with us. I've got a set of questions I'm going to work through, really to draw out your collective insights and expertise, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience. So get yourselves ready for that one. Monique, I'll start with you. As I said, I mean, the CEFC's played an enormous role in Australia, and I think, we're now seeing green banks emerge in other markets and other countries around the world. In fact, I think many of them modelled on the success of the CEFC in Australia. You've been here at COP for a few days now, but I guess interested in your perspective on the role of green banks, the role of the CEFC to crowd in private investment to the sort of scales that we know we're going to need, that as outlined by Cobat.
Thanks very much, Kane. So I think John just jokingly asked me whether everyone in Australia has to go through Macquarie as a rite of passage, and yes, we are like cockroaches, we turn up everywhere, but what I would not have told you at Macquarie that I will tell you now is that my job in a green bank is to is for everyone else in the world to do enough of a job that I get made redundant. So that's effectively my job, and what that involves is accelerate. And unfortunately for everyone here at COP, but fortunately for me, it's not a perfect world, and so we have been very needed and very active in the space. We're the world's largest green bank, which is very significant for the size of the Australian economy, and we've recently taken on the challenge of being the lending arm to help with rewiring the nation. What I mean by saying we need to make ourselves redundant is that even $30.5 billion in the scheme of the numbers that Conrad had is meaningless. So our job is to get the private sector to do the heavy lifting. We've done that quite successfully. With the first 12-something billion that we've invested has catalysed projects worth 50 billion, so that's a decent run rate, but even though that proportionally, we need to get much more. So what do? We have to be nimble in a changing world, so we will stretch and retract our risk appetite as we need to as technologies become feasible. We will incentivise consumer behaviour to make the green choice over the brown choice, and that can happen either two ways, either by a sweetener in the return, or by us taking certain risks that aren't able to be taken by the private sector. And finally, and this is very much what the Rewiring the Nation is about, the role of green banks is to really help a bit with that intergenerational equity question. So there is a cost that needs to be borne by today's generations to support the others, one of which I can see over there in the corner, and at her first COP. So part of that is to take risks and to take on the taxpayer balance sheet, to take some pain that needs to be borne to help smooth that cost, so it's not all coming to energy ratepayers, and it can be smoothed a bit more across the economy.
Great, thank you. John, I might throw to you, be interested in your perspectives. What I didn't mention is once upon a time you worked at World Bank, you've been around these sorts of institutions for some time. How are you seeing the role of public institutions, green banks evolve over time, and what do you see their role into the future?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kane, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm an American working for an Australian company, heading to Sydney tonight, so a pleasure to spend some time getting the accent into my head before I land tomorrow morning and be jolted by by what I'm hearing. I spent time at the World Bank. I also spent 5 years under the Obama administration at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is our development finance institution. And the role of institutions like DFIs, MDBs, to some extent, green banks and others, is a critical one, and it's a de-risking one, it's a catalytic one. And I think the question for ourselves today, as we think about the numbers that Kobad put on the screen, is not whether these institutions are important. They are. It's how to get the most climate bang for public dollar buck out of the institutions, whether their focus is domestic, international, emerging markets, or wherever. And one of the things we did when I was at Treasury as Secretary Yellen's climate counselor over the last 2 years is we kicked off something called the MDB Evolution Agenda, which many of you may be tracking. And one of the key pillars of that agenda was how to, quoting her, get more climate bang for the public dollar buck. How do you use that $1 of public resources to catalyze the maximum amount of private finance? The numbers that you put forward a moment ago, the 1-to-1 where we are today, fossils to renewables, very similar to the amount of public money to private money mobilized that we see in the MDB and DFI system right now. That ratio has to be much higher. We need to increase the ratio of public money to private. And that's one of the things we think we can do in that MDB evolution agenda right now, is very much focused on how do you change incentives, how do you change tools, and how do you incentivize more private capital to flow? Again, that question we're trying to address in emerging markets is similar to the one that we're trying to address in our own economies. And I'm confident that the process we've kicked off will result in an increase. It won't get to the 1-to-10 ratio that you show is needed in renewables to fossils, but it will increase, I think, the public to private ratio from 1-to-1 where it is now to more like 1-to-2 to 1-to-3 over the coming years. And that will result in billions of more dollars flowing annually into the system.
Well, we might stick with you. I mean, talk about changing incentives and mechanisms. The Inflation Reduction Act was obviously a game changer for the globe, clearly a massive intervention in the terms of the United States. you know, we're a year on. Can you maybe share some of your insights as to how it's working, what it's delivering? Is it working as intended?
Look, I'll try to be objective about this, because obviously I was kind of there at inception as part of an administration that germinated the concept. So objectively speaking, it has outperformed expectations. You know, we've seen, depending on whose numbers you believe, somewhere between 280 and $300 billion worth of investment that we believe would not otherwise have occurred, certainly on the timescale that it has, in the first year and change of the bill coming into law. That's extraordinary, right? That's unprecedented. And so, putting aside the very important question of efficiency and trade distortion, and all questions which are rightfully raised by partners around the world, the impact that bill has had in terms of US manufacturing, jobs, innovation, and investment has been unparalleled, historically. And importantly, from a political standpoint, as you will surely appreciate, the impact of that legislation has been broadly felt across jurisdictions, across states, irrespective of political leanings of those states. And I think that will make this law as durable as it was intended to be. People are worried about what might happen in a unimaginable electoral situation in about a year's time. I'm not worried. That bill has roots, and it's having the impact that we intended. So I'm an optimist about its long-term durability.
We might come back and get you to dust off your crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen in a year's time and its ramifications, but we'll save that for a bit later. Let's bring it back into Australia. Matt, as I said, RES has been a leading developer. You've been at the forefront of some of the really exciting developments in the industry over the past decade. I guess, given where we find ourselves now, what do you see as the challenges in leveraging the sort of debt and equity that we're going to need from a renewable energy development perspective? What are the challenges, and are we making the right progress?
Thanks, Kane. Well, it's certainly a good question. There are always plenty of challenges, and we're not seeing that change anytime soon. I think we are seeing that we're making some progress, but there's still a long way to go. So from a RES perspective, we're in the fortunate position that we're global. We operate in 23 countries, so we get to see what's happening around the world. And exactly as you said, John, we're seeing all this investment going into the US and the challenges of attracting investment across the different countries that we operate in. We've also got a business model where we take full development risk, so we're there from day one of finding the sites to getting them just to the point where they're ready to construct, and then we bring in finance, equity and debt at that point. So we understand from a RES perspective how we compare the efficiency of the development process. And when I'm looking to secure capital from the board at a group level, there's a competition between all of those countries to get investment into development. So it's key that the country has the right development cycle in place to attract that capital into Australia. And then we go out to the market, so we see what the international market for equity and debt looks like when we go through construction. Maybe just briefly, when we look at the challenges, we probably see it in three broad buckets. Firstly is the development process itself. Secondly is project returns. We're seeing a lot of pressure on project returns at the moment. And then finally, there's an interesting evolution in the Australian market about construction and the changing risk appetite on construction risk. So maybe I'll just quickly go into a little bit of detail on each of those. So development, what's development? It's typically land, planning, grid, and social license. So land in Australia is fine. We're seeing some challenges there, and particularly as more competition comes into renewable energy zones. So we're seeing a lot of competition in the same area and creates some tension, but that's no different to what we're seeing in other markets. Planning is a key issue in Australia. It's expensive, it takes a long time, and it's a highly risky process. So there's a lot of work that needs to be put into planning. Different states have different planning regimes, but some are better than others, but it's a big focus in the market. And separately, you have the federal process, the EPBC approval process, which is also fairly slow at the moment, although there's some work underway on that. Grid, everyone who works in Australia knows that grid is a key challenge. There's the connection process itself is cumbersome, and also we need new transmission to be able to build out the type of renewables we need to get to the 82% target. So there's challenges there. Social license always been fundamentally important for developers. If you get that wrong, you don't build the next project. And now we're seeing from the investment community and governments who are stepping into projects more focus on social license. Quickly on project returns, it's really challenging at the moment. There's a lot more. There's the macro position of increasing interest rates and inflation, so pushing up the cost of equity and debt. But we're also seeing supply chain issues. Very hard to get kit into Australia, very hard to get kit, wind turbines, transformers, even simple stuff like circuit breakers for substations have got 2-3 year lead times at the moment. So it's a big issue, and we need support to get that in. And we know that at a high level, projects are really coming under significant pressure. Costs are going up. The OEMs on the wind turbine side are making a loss at the moment, so they're all putting their costs up. And in an Australian context, construction costs as well are going up significantly more than we're seeing in other markets. So big pressures there. And we're not yet seeing the PPAs and the offtake market catch up with where it needs to be to make the returns that investors want. So there's a lot of work there. And finally, on construction risk, there's been a lot of challenging projects in the last 3 years in renewables construction. So the risk profile that the contractors are willing to take is changing, and so we're having to work through that. So yeah, lots of challenges. I would say that across many of those areas, there's work in progress to improve them, but there's a long way to go.
Thanks, Matt. A sobering assessment, I think, of the state and some of those challenges. We'll return back. Don't leave now, because we're going to close out with a dose of greater optimism. But it's good to put those on the table. Sally, I mean, the work that you do, you've been involved in a lot of deals, deal structures, evolving models. I mean, what are you seeing in the marketplace? How is the deal structures and financing models evolving to deal with and respond to some of the challenges Matt outlined, and also sort of the evolving policy environment? What are you seeing?
So for context, KPMG has been very active in deals in the Australian market, and I guess the greatest thing that I can say is that Matt's point's entirely right. It is only getting harder in some senses, and what we're also seeing is that things like the cost of capital increasing is really beginning to bite. But I guess what's really interesting for us is that we've got to take this into context, is that only 15% of our investment in renewables is actually local. That means 85% of our investment is coming from overseas. And as a result of that, the message that I put to you all is that if you're looking to come to the investment into the Australian market, you've got to be creative. If you think you can come into the Australian market and just do the same deal that you've done somewhere else and just cookie cut it across, that's not probably the right approach. And so as a result, those who have been successful have had to think a little bit outside of the box. And so some of the things that, in contrast, we've only had 3 pros go financial close this year, but we've actually had almost 25 deals be transacted on. What difference is there is that they're not transacting at financial close. They're now coming in earlier. They're taking a little bit more risk. They're understanding some of the things like social license and native title. You can't just hand over to someone else and not do it yourself. So that's been a really key change in the way they think about them being slightly a bit more in the development risk and then being part of the construction operation model. Some of the other risks, perhaps some of the other structures that we've really been empowering is, what are we actually selling here? Are we selling just electrons, or are we selling a net zero product? And that evolution of business models trying to play around the concept of actually, how can we actually now sell a net zero lease? Or how can we sell a green farm? So going to the concept where you're buying a farm with a wind capacity as opposed to buying a wind farm. So these evolutions business models are really important. They're important because not only do they help us evolve some of the challenges that Matt's talked about, but they also help us move across sector of assets and classes. And we know investors are very tied to benchmarks, and we know, for example, investments in the real estate market compared to investments in the energy market have different hurdles. So this has been some of the innovations and the things that we've done in order to be able to think about that. One more that I think is really worth touching, and that's been the role of the private-public partnerships that we've seen in energy. I think that is a really interesting one because there really can't be a PPP in energy, but they've got to be some kind of hybridism in terms of that role that plays. And I was very fortunate to go and spend some time with Mazda and have a look at how they look at PPPs in the energy sector, and it is very much a different risk allocation. In some ways, it actually speeds up the issues that Matt's talking about because it's very clear who's doing what and who's good at doing the things that they're good at and who's getting kind of the right risk reward. But certainly the key message there is that there's a lot of innovation that we're seeing, and investors continue to innovate. It's not in some sense a super mature market yet.
Yeah, Matt, maybe to come back to you on that point. I mean, we've seen a lot of new policy in Australia. We've seen governments, both state and Commonwealth, play a much more active role in the energy market, whether that be Victoria and the SECV, reintroduction of the SECV, obviously New South Wales through the Altessas. I don't know whether the former Minister Matt Kane's in the audience, but he's certainly here today. Queensland government, and then obviously recently with the Commonwealth announcing an expanded capacity investment scheme. I mean, as a private developer, how do you see all of that playing out? How do you make sense of all of that? And is it all helping to leverage in more private investment into the renewable energy sector?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we don't always make sense of it, but we follow it and we use it to drive the business. So RES has been in Australia for the last 20 years, and when we first came into the market, there was really not any fundamental drivers for renewables. There was a small renewable energy target, but there was no state incentives. So we started in New South Wales. It was where the largest population was, where the demand was, so it made sense. But then fairly quickly, the Victorian government came out with their own policy, which really attracted a lot of our investment into Victoria. And we had some very successful projects down there. And then more recently, as you say, the New South Wales government with their roadmap has put in place a really powerful incentive for development to come to New South Wales. And then Queensland with the QEJP, the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, are doing a really good job of attracting renewables developers into Queensland. So yeah, we see that our capital has really been directed by policy changes largely at a state level, and on top of that, of course, there's the federal renewable energy target. I think, a few interesting points there around government ownership. There is this interesting trend back towards government ownership in Australia. Interestingly, from a RES perspective, that works really well because our business model is that we do all of the development work and then we don't get involved in the equity, so we sell down at the start of construction. So we're a little bit unusual that we're not an IPP, so it works perfectly for us. But I know there's quite a lot of concern from the IPPs that it will crowd them out, and we do see that probably that there is so much money required, as Kobad pointed out, to build out what's required in Australia. It's going to take a combination of both government and private capital to do that, and we see that as a really good blend. And we see even in Queensland some of the government-owned corporations looking to partner with private capital to create the best risk profile for the project, and that's much like Sally was talking about. On the capacity investment scheme, it's very impressive to see the federal government come in with such a powerful, ambitious approach. They've noticed, as the Clean Energy Council has highlighted, that there's been limited investment in new renewables in Australia, so something had to change. And we think the CIS is a very ambitious way of achieving that goal, but we have seen from the international markets that we work across that those type of mechanisms can be highly successful, or they can have some significant pitfalls if you don't get the design right. So I think it's really key at the moment for the federal government to engage very closely with the private sector, deep consultation, and make sure we get the design right. And if it's right, then it will be a big push to getting to the target.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'm sure we'll hear more from Minister Bowen. I think he's now at the COP. He's focused on obviously the negotiations, but we're hearing from him over the coming days about the role of the CIS, and we're working very closely with the Commonwealth Government on the finer detail and implementation as quickly as possible. Monique, we might change direction a little bit. I mean, as Matt said, the way in which these policies are leveraging capital into the market. I mean, the Australian government and the Federal Treasurer in particular has been very focused on the role of Australia's superannuation and an enormous amount of wealth sitting there in those superannuation funds, a role for them in in supporting the clean energy transition. What are your observations on how's that going? In fact, you may or may not want to comment on some very recent interventions from one particular Australian super fund. I suspect you don't want to comment on that, but obviously they're on a journey as far as their role in the energy transition. Your observations on how that's tracking, what are the challenges, what do we need to do to leverage more of that?
Yeah, thanks, Kane. So over the last 10 years, we've engaged very strongly with the superannuation because we're very curious as to why they haven't invested more strongly. I think the answer, as Sally said, is that everything has had to have a lot of creativity around it. And bless their hearts, superannuation funds are not creative, nor should they be. They are designed around a different human rights need, which is to keep retired people comfortable and at least cost to the state. And so when we engage with them, they tell us, well, we can achieve the same return for less risk or a higher return for the same risk by investing offshore. So they have been very active in renewables offshore, not so much onshore. And part of what they will need to come onshore is more certainty on the revenue side, which I hope a well-designed capacity investment scheme should then attract the lowest cost of capital investors, which is what we've seen happening overseas. One other development, I think you referred to Chalmers' announcements on having a look at how the Your Future, Your Super benchmarking process has perhaps backfired a little bit for renewables. The purpose of that was to effectively name and shame poorly performing funds, but the way that it has played out in practice is that the sugar hits from oil and gas and the perhaps older investments, backwards-looking investments in other pieces of infrastructure have meant that the fund returns, the benchmarks, are higher than can be achieved under sensible assumptions in the renewables industry. So they have been reluctant to invest because that name and shame, that blacklisting is really egregious to them. And so I think if there were adjustments over time to that would facilitate taking on board other factors, I think that's actually really strongly supported from their members, because what we are hearing is there's a great desire by their membership base to have more green options and that they see that as sort of a defensive strategy against other economic ups and downs, but it's been hard for them in practice.
Yeah, really good point, and I think that's a reform that I think is overdue. I think there's a recognition that something needs to change, and now I think a process underway to work that through. John, I might bring you in here in terms of, Monique made reference to some of the risk portfolio and the challenges of managing and pricing risk. I mean, interested in your maybe looking at it more broadly from a climate risk perspective. We're here at COP. There's a lot of discussion about obviously the material impacts of climate change, but around how do financial markets, how does US Treasury, how do wealth funds, how are they going? What's the journey in terms of pricing and managing the climate risk in the financial markets and systems?
One of the reasons I went back into government unexpectedly for the first 2 years of the Biden administration is that the Treasury Department had created a new role as climate counselor to the Secretary Yellen. And I had served 7 years under Obama, and my wife and I and all of our friends, or my wife and I and my family, had agreed I would never serve in government again, not because it wasn't wonderful, but because it was exhausting and depleting, and the game had shifted to the outside, and it was about mobilizing capital. It was about getting private companies to invest more quickly. However, financial markets need to be incentivized, need to be cajoled, tweaked, moved. And the Treasury Department within the United States government occupies a particularly lofty perch with respect to how to do that. Secretary Yellen oversees something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is the alphabet soup of regulators, FDIC, Fed, SEC, et cetera, who manage and coordinate regulatory issues. And when she came in, the first FSOC meeting that she convened had climate as the #1 agenda. And what that meant to me, as someone considering coming back into government, was that this was a Treasury Department, an administration, and a Treasury Department committed to using the power of the pulpit and encouraging regulators, not enforcing, because these are all independent financial regulators, but, and Secretary Yellen, of course, herself was the former chair of the Federal Reserve Board, so she has a great deal of respect for the independence of the financial regulators. But under President Biden's leadership, the FSOC kicked off a process of focusing on climate-related financial risk. And there was an executive order and a series of work plans that came out of that. which resulted in October of 2021 of the FSOC reporting for the first time ever that climate change represents, and this is important, an emerging and increasing risk to the stability of the US financial system. And that finding, that statement, compelled the financial regulators to get more active on this issue. And arguably, as someone who believes that we can do all we want in terms of getting public monies to catalyze, and critically important, at the end of the day, until financial markets have internalized the cost, the risks, and the costs of carbon and climate, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle. And so what we have now, obviously, as you likely do as well, is the financial regulatory system focusing on the risk profile of climate risk, the risk profile of climate. And that is a new thing for our jurisdiction. It certainly follows behind the Europeans who have been focused on this for a while. But I think the changes that we will see with respect to financial risk regulation will be arguably one of the most important drivers of change in financial markets in the coming years. And there, the trajectory is clear. As a corporate advisory business, we advise our clients to take a look at the direction of travel in financial risk around the world, financial risk regulation. And where we are today is not where we're going to be in 5 years. If you think that we're kind of at the plateau of financial risk regulation, you're wrong. You as a corporation, a financial institution, are going to be subject to far more onerous, in my view, appropriate regulatory requirements, starting with disclosure, but moving far beyond that and relatively quickly. So that's why I went back into government, because that role of government to ensure that financial regulators are incorporating financial risk into their thinking about risks to the economy is critical. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act represents the other side of that, which is a fiscal stimulus bill to take advantage of what we see as the opportunities embedded in that same risk profile. So very important question. We advise our financial clients to look 5 years forward and design their policies for that world, not the world we're in today, because we're moving in one direction.
Let's come back to the Trump question. I mean, how do those markets, the momentum that's been built, the assumptions about what the market looks like in 3 and 5 years' time, what are the assumptions being built in on a change of leadership, and what will, I think you've answered the question as far as the IRA, but what will it mean for financial markets and pricing climate?
I think it's hard to, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was easy to laugh at a Trump question. It's hard to laugh at a Trump question now. So just pause on that for a moment. Yeah, it is a incredibly dire potential in terms of not where it takes us from a climate perspective, but in so many other ways. And as a U.S. passport holder, it pains me to even consider the potential. So I just want to put that out there. It's easy to laugh and chuckle at it, but we're beyond that. We're in serious land now. On a lighter note,
but please.
Look, again, direction of travel clear. You said don't talk about the IRA, but the IRA is important because the IRA is what's going to embed the corporate and financial, I think, commitment to a clean energy and broader decarbonization agenda, because we have reframed it appropriately as an economic opportunity and are driving jobs and growth in that direction. And those 10-year incentives, I think, are going to be impossible to roll back because they're going to be rooted, and already are, in so many localities and regions around the country. From a financial regulatory standpoint, we've already seen what happens when there is a Trump presidency. Federal government steps back and states step forward. And we've already seen in California, a couple months ago, they're clearly moving forward on financial regulation. Their financial regulation bill, which passed, which is far more expansive than what the SEC is likely to do shortly, will be the defining financial regulation and disclosure regime in the US for years to come. Other states will then adopt it, and we'll have a race to the top as opposed to a race to the bottom. So on financial regulation in the US, I think that we're going to see states stepping forward in important ways, even if we don't have the outcome of the election that I fear, and that's already beginning. So I'm an optimist in that front.
I don't know, Monique or Sally, whether you want to comment, the focus and development around disclosure. I mean, how important is that? Where are we at on that journey in Australia?
I think it works. I think the disclosure is a really important one. It's important for a couple of reasons. One is because it levels the playing field. So I think globally is only about 50% of organisations who have been known to voluntarily disclose. I think in Australia our number is a lot less than that, and I'm not going to embarrass us by saying what it is. But what I will say that I think that making sure that there's clarity on what is being disclosed, how those metrics are measured, who's measuring what, the maths that's going into what people are reporting is really important. I think the other thing around that disclosure requirements, it's going to go back to your point, which is around how institutions like super are communicating their progress and how that progress is being managed locally versus offshore. The other important area of disclosure, other than it's going to be fantastic for all consultants, of which I'm not going to be involved in that, but it is going to be a massive burden administratively in being able to do it. But I think what it does need to recognise is that it's going to enable a huge amount of investments in the systems that are required to monitor it, in the systems that are required to record it. It's not uncommon for institutions to say, we don't actually know the size of, we don't actually even know where what the number is, let alone how we calculate it. We don't know where the emissions are coming from. So there's a lot being done, and it's been really empowering here at COP to be able to see a huge amount of technologies that can help industry and institutions be able to solve that problem across the whole chain.
I'm going to come back to each of you actually to share some reflections on COP and some of the exciting developments or your hopes in coming days and as they relate to finance. But we've got some time now to throw to the audience. So welcome anyone who's got a question for our panel. I thought Ian would. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kane. Thanks, panel. Really interesting discussion. Ian McGill from the University of New South Wales. And my question really relates to this competition in finance, and Monique was talking about that with a superannuation sort of hat on. But I'm also sort of just trying to think, when we looked at COBAD's slides, there's all this clean energy investment, but there's no imputed carbon offsets and removals in that, which kind of makes sense in a way. But all of you are involved in that, right? I mean, pollination does that, CFC's funding some removals projects, KPMG does everything. Maybe not you, Matt. The estimate I saw was around $400 million a year in just the removals market last year. So you rank that up against the $1 trillion on clean energy finance, and then you think about the competition. So at a corporate level around strategy, some corporates do seem to have a choice between actually reducing emissions or just getting into offsets and removals. And I just wonder if that's also, hence, a competition in the finance space as well.
This may not be a very popular view, but it is my view, and that is we can't let perfection be the enemy of good. I think that for all of us who've been involved in clean energy, we're all passionate about it. We want to make it happen. We want to create these opportunities for organisations to happen. But when you sit on the other side and you hear some of the challenges they're facing, you do need to be able to provide them other ways or other go-to-market to that solution. And if offsets is going to play a role in the intermediaries process, it needs to, and it's important for them to do that. I think what we have to be careful though in this, and this is one of the hopes for COP, is that there's got to be no cheating. So there can't be a path where you can, if you go down this road and it gets you there and you're going to pay, it's going to cost you this much. But if you go down this path and that way, you're going to get there maybe slightly different. It's going to be a different cost. There's got to be some overarching mechanisms depending on which way you work through on the offsets. The other thing is that the liquidity of it has always and continues to be a problem. And what was really disheartening for me as an individual was seeing so many of the larger players using the offsets in a financial capacity to actually make more financial gains than to actually voluntarily surrender them. So I think there's just got to be a purpose to why these offsets are created, how they're created, and a little bit of equality around the different ways that they can be utilised.
Monique or John, did you want to add anything? Don't need to. We've got plenty more hands up in the audience. All right, let's continue. I think Frank.
Thanks, Frank Yotsua. And you, just wondering if anyone on the panel really wanted to share any thoughts specifically on industrial decarbonisation and financing thereof, including the export-oriented industries that we might hope will emerge, and in particular, international sources of finance, right? I mean, there's a tradition there in our energy export industries to, in part or large part, rely on overseas finance. There can, of course, also be a hedging element in terms of future price risk and so forth. So any comments along on those topics, be very interested.
Just for me at a very high level, so I think we saw the slides on the energy mix, and despite how tough that is, it's the easy part of the transition. The technology's there and it's at a reasonable cost. It is cheaper than the alternative. I spent a good meeting this morning with a steel manufacturer, learning about the different technologies there. On the finance piece, I think given that much of that technology will be imported, and Europe in particular has a very strong network of banks that do guarantees to then bring in domestic banks, I think that will be a really important, and that's not something CFC does provide, but it is something the European banks provide, and it is a way of getting local certainty with new technology risk, which I think in any part of I'm thinking the big refinery steel manufacturing will be an important part of the financing picture, because these projects are in the many billions and you can't do them on a pilot scale. So
just a 10-second intervention on that. I mean, I think one of the things that is underappreciated, certainly by the clients that we speak with, is the coming impact of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms in key jurisdictions around the world. And I think if you project forward, the European CBAM will be the start of a broader set of CBAMs, which will have their own complications, but certainly the carbon intensity of production and manufacturing is going to become an increasing liability for those companies who are in that space. That doesn't answer the financing question, but it does tip the economics of the status quo in important ways.
Great, thank you.
Dave Kelly, I'm a state MP from Western Australia. I'd just be interested if you got any comments about the availability of capital for companies who are looking to initiate new fossil fuel projects in Australia, because obviously that's the other side of the coin. Any comments about that?
So the politically correct... I think it works, yeah. So I think that we get, at KPMG, we get requests of all kinds. I have to say the last time I had anyone ask about the potential of that was probably a little over 3 years ago, so that gives you a bit of a signal. Having said that, those who have asked the questions are looking at it from an area like carbon capture and storage. So the question that they're asking is around what role can carbon capture and storage. I think that in reality, I mean, if I take like our desk as any example, we receive a huge amount of interest internationally for investments in clean energy, and 99.9% of them are asking about clean energy. So I guess that's a positive sign.
We are almost out of time. I know there's one last question from the floor.
Hi there. Thanks very much for a really interesting discussion, actually, particularly around the frameworks and new solutions. One thing that I've picked up during COP is actually the discussion between adaptation and mitigation. And I noticed that didn't see any numbers in relation to that on your charts. I was just wondering, you know, given that we have a limited pool of money, what are you seeing in that space, and how can we navigate that?
The line between adaptation and mitigation is a fuzzy one in some ways, and so as we think about from a government perspective, former government perspective, how we account for funding and what constitutes adaptation and what constitutes mitigation, it's not a clear line. To some extent, that's part of what's being discussed, frankly, in the inner circle, right, in the negotiating language. I will say that we see increasing opportunities to invest into adaptation-related sectors and opportunities. Pollination was announced 2 days ago as a climate and impact advisor to a $1.5 billion adaptation-oriented debt fund that's going to be focused on adaptation projects in emerging markets, focusing on things like water, food, health. And so we are confident that we are in adaptation finance where we were in mitigation finance about 10 years ago, just to simplify, right? We see opportunities, we see funding and financing mechanisms, and we see a lot of public money that is beginning to reorient itself towards catalyzing private investment into adaptation. So it's not a satisfactory answer, but a short answer to say I think we're kicking off an important set of funding initiatives toward adaptation. I'd be happy to speak with you later if that's useful.
Thanks, John. We are almost out of time, so I'm going to throw to each of you just a quick answer, really observation about really what either has happened at COP or what you hope will happen at COP over the coming days that will catalyse and bring forward and support the levels of finance that we need for the energy transition globally or in Australia. Matt, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think the clear win out of COP so far is the tripling of renewables commitments. As you say, we've got more than 120 countries have signed up to that, and that's really demonstrating that this is a clear path forwards to making a massive difference, and it's great to see Australia on that list. And I just think there's a lot of work to be done with the Australian government and the private investment community to just make sure we get to our target.
Thank you, John.
I think one of the underreported stories and developments at the COP has been the kind of holding of hands of players and what I call keepers of the orthodoxy on the voluntary carbon market side. There were some really important announcements a couple days ago where previously warring or competing parties quietly said, hey, the voluntary carbon markets have been bashed, beat up to the point of being essentially non-functioning. And we recognize as a community that an effective voluntary carbon market is critical to channeling finance in important ways. And there were some quiet hand-holding and kumbaya moments where key players committed to working together to solidify the standards around the VCM space, which will be critical, I think, to channeling large amounts of capital to very important use of proceeds over the coming years.
For me, I think my observation, my last COP was 19 years ago, and it was so different. I think really, like standing around, the momentum was around, groups of negotiators getting in a room, negotiating about a comma for months. And, that was really important. It's got us to where we are. But what I've been struck by now is the amount of people's time that they're spending, private company time and resource and the weight of capital that is ready to invest. And what I'm hoping is that the fact that so much of the world is on that the big companies and the private sector is on that pathway now will insulate us to some extent from the ups and downs of the political cycles that we invariably will get over the next decade.
Great. Thanks, Monique. Sally?
Well, it has been very empowering, and it's been very, it's been surprising in some sense to be able to see agreement, for example, on a renewable energy target, and I think some of that alignment has been fantastic. I think there's no doubt the culture of everybody coming here together being so empowered, and the amount of funds that have been announced by countries like Vietnam, the work that China has done in being able to commit to some of the pledges. So I think some of the players who traditionally have been a little bit sitting on the fence, it's really been great to see them coming into the fence. But for me, no doubt, I have been very impressed by the role that the oil parties or that those involved in the oil space have been part of the conversation. I understand to many of us they haven't said the right things, and they haven't, but if you think about the situation where we were maybe even a year ago, there was no engagement or little engagement. Now there is some engagement. It is one step towards progress, and I believe we're not going to get anywhere unless we get those deep emitters who are actually being part of that conversation. So I think the UAE investing $270 billion and committing that, I think for an oil country is phenomenal. So let's hope more of that comes.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to end on a note of optimism. We know our time is up because I just heard the sound of coffee beans being tipped into the coffee machine. It opens again at 1. We'd be mad to try and continue after 1 o'clock. This room's going to start buzzing even more than it has been for the last hour. Thank you to all of you for being part of the conversation. Great questions. I'm sure the panellists would be happy to continue the conversation. Clearly, an enormous amount of capital investment required in Australia and indeed around the world. Sounds like we've got some challenges to overcome, but we're pointing in the right direction. Let's hope for a good outcome in coming days that help us get there. Can you, thank you to Matt, to John, to Monique and to Sally. Please join me in thanking our panel today.